Tony? There are some troublemakers around here, I tell you. Could I ask if there are any people from the media present tonight? Hands up, please. Anyone from the media? Independent media, yes. Anyone else from the media? Now, the media were told about this. I would have assumed there'd be at least 40 or 50 people here to hear what was going to be said about such an important issue. Is it not interesting? I've seen the same thing in Canberra when we've put meetings on about very important issues and had very capable speakers talking about it. The media don't come at all. Do you know, the Hobart Mercury, in a report recently on Wendy Skerr, said that she was talking with a Victorian man, Andrew McGregor. And I thought it was interesting to refer to Andrew as a Victorian man. One wonders whether they could have mentioned a former police man. This may have had something to add to the credibility of what was being said. For indeed, Andrew was a member of the Victorian Police Service for 17 years. And as I said earlier, he's speaking on the same topic as Wendy, Port Arthur, deceit and terrorism. And he joins Wendy as our first two speakers at the 2001 Inverell Forum. Andrew, sadly, is no stranger to tragedy. In 1967, his sister was murdered. And Andrew was aware that the police at the time knew of threats to his sister's life, but took no effective action. And he believes that her life could have been saved and she would be alive today, only for that police inaction. And this was the major motivation for Andrew becoming a member of the police force, in the attempt or belief that he could do it differently. Andrew was in the old Victorian Scottish Regiment for 5 years. Tonight his talk is divided into 5 sections. The way he's done that is to give us an opportunity to ask questions after each section relevant to that section. The first section is the Broad Arrow Cafe. The second is moving from the cafe to the Seascape Lodge and the start of the siege. The third section is to do with the weapons that were used. The fourth section is to do with Martin Bryant's arrest and many, many unusual coincidences that have happened around that time and since then. And the fifth section is to do with what has happened since the time of Port Arthur. He's not previously spoken publicly on what he knows. Tonight we will get the full story for the first time. Andrew has written a book on Port Arthur, Deceit and Terrorism, the Massacre at Port Arthur. On the back there's a quote. It says, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania." This was Barry Unsworth as New South Wales Premier in December 1987, 9 years before the Port Arthur killings. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the Inverell Forum stage, Andrew McGregor.
Thank you, Dennis. You referred to me as being a former member of the Victoria Police Service. We actually called it the Victoria Police Farce. All right, I'll start. Wendy Skerr and I have come here tonight to pass on what information we have in relation to the Port Arthur massacre. I have used their documents, articles and interviews to gather this information. Neither Wendy nor I will accept any bunkum as the gunman being equal to the world's top anti-terrorist combat shooters for two reasons. One, the shooting inside the Broad Arrow Cafe lasted approximately 5 minutes. Two, there was in excess of 41 shots fired inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. This is from some of the survivors from both inside and outside the cafe. Let's name some of these survivors. Firstly, there is Wendy Skerr, who is with us tonight. Then there is Major Sandra Vanderpeer, who was inside the gift shop area, and in her statement states that the shooting lasted approximately 5 minutes. And she believed that the shooting continued after the gunman reloaded inside the gift shop area. Graham Collier, an ex-RAF fitter, states that he watched the gunman walk around the cafe area, shooting people for approximately 4.5 minutes, as he lay on the floor nearly drowning in his own blood. Outside, near the information centre, two Vietnam veterans, John Godfrey and Peter Stainthorpe, also have contested the 90 seconds to 2 minutes time for the shooting inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. Jackie Lane wrote an article in a police magazine, again stating that the shooting went on for about 5 minutes. The time frame for the gunman shooting inside the cafe for 90 seconds to 2 minutes maximum is fabricated. It is an outright lie. And any person peddling that story is pushing a concoction, an outright lie. All the witnesses tell us that the gunman went up to the victims and shot them from fairly close quarters. What the Americans tell me is that anyone with a little bit of proper training in firearms would be able to accomplish this deed. And I accept their advice. What this means is that Martin Bryant would have been able to perform the shooting skills required at the Broad Arrow Cafe with minimum training if he had wished to commit such an atrocity. However, there are many clues that state it was not Martin Bryant inside the cafe on that fatal afternoon. More bunkum is the statement that the gunman killed 12 victims and wounded another 4 in the first 15 seconds. This statement is supposedly supported by the Wilkinson videotape. And this tape recorded the sound of the shots by themselves. Another video camera recorded the shots fired for 25 seconds as being 21 shots, which according to the government prosecutor, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, leaves only 8 shots to be fired in the next 65 seconds. That is 1 shot every 8.5 seconds. This is not what the witnesses tell us. They all state that the shots continued at about 1 shot every second or 2. Now, one moment, I'll see if I can find the first videotape here. Now, this will take a little bit of time to load up, and we'll see what happens. Come on. Computers, they're modern, they're beautiful things. They can tell a story far better than what I can. I don't think... Unfortunately, it doesn't show up, but on the CD-ROM you will hear it. The last shot, the 17th shot, is a ricochet. What? In the Wilkinson tape, there are 5 shots fired, being shot 7 to 11 within a period of 1.80 seconds. And we are supposed to believe that any person could shoot 5 persons accurately in the head in that time? Thank you. Mind you, as I said, the last shot heard on the Wilkinson videotape is a ricochet. The next piece of bunkum is that 29 shots were fired inside the cafe. Mr. Bugg, QC, continually reinforces this statement, stating it is supported by the ballistics and forensic evidence. But the Tasmania Police ballistics expert, Sergeant Derek Dutton, states otherwise. In the American Wound Ballistics Review, Dutton states that 30 fired cartridge cases were located inside the Broad Arrow Cafe, not 29. Then again, in another article written by Sergeant Derek Dutton in the Australian Police Journal, Dutton argues that it is not accurate to count the number of shots fired simply by the means of the fired cartridge cases alone, especially as the crime scenes were not protected until after sunset. And many of the fired cartridge cases had been souvenired, especially in the car park where only 4 cases were located by the police. 2.223 and 2.308 cartridges, with another case being returned by a bus driver. How many shots were fired inside the Broad Arrow Cafe during the massacre? I have calculated a minimum of 41 shots using the court document and witness statements. So why were these deceptions put into place? And why have they been so strongly enforced within Australia? These lies have nothing to do with any federal government implementation plans, but rather a cover-up by the Tasmanian government, which are the owners of the Port Arthur historic site. And it has everything to do with a supposedly locked fire escape door. Number 2, let's see how we go on this one.
The cause of the murders was not a door. The cause of the murders was Martin Bryant firing lethal weapons at people in a very short space of time, a matter of seconds, and murdering 20 people in the Broad Arrow Cafe and 15 elsewhere, and of course wounding many people. I don't believe that door issue is a principal factor in the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Ray Groom. You see, there was a fire exit door within the gift shop area of the Broad Arrow Cafe that was supposedly locked. But just how do you lock a fire exit door? This was the door that prevented many people who were inside the gift shop area from escaping the gunmen. And some were murdered, and others lost their partners and loved ones. It was later conceded that this door was not locked, as stated, to the Hobart Supreme Court, but rather it was broken. And the condition of the door was known to police by the 1st of May 1996, when one of the maintenance crew who was painting out the windows and nailing the doors and windows shut discovered that fault with the assistance of one of the forensic police within the building. The next little gem is the Prince sports bag, or should I say 2 Prince sports bags. You see, the gunman was lugging around a very heavy Prince sports bag and a large video camera, which were then found left on a table inside the Broad Arrow Cafe after the massacre. The problem is that several witnesses also saw the gunman carry the Prince sports bag out of the cafe and put it in the boot of the Volvo. This was even captured on James Velasco's video. Right, 3 Velasco.
Dumbfounded, and I saw a man walk out of the cafe. We were 50 feet away from him, and he was carrying a rifle. There's somebody going crazy shooting people here. There he is. He's over there. I can't believe it. He walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
As Bryant went to the boot of his Volvo,
he's picking up the bag now.
Rifle, James Velasco was doing some shooting of his own. Shooting with his home video.
That's the guy right there.
Velasco's fiancée, Cynthia, saw Bryant claim another victim.
Royce, our driver, stepped out from behind the bus and walked towards the cafe, towards the front of the coaches to see what was going on. And then
I'm running out of time, so I'm going to cut it off here.
So we both saw Royce.
Bad cafe.
Can you make the screens a bit bigger?
No.
Left the cafe at 1:32. He'd been inside less than 2 minutes, yet he killed 20 people. Steve.
If you have a look at that area, see all the tables, they're all nice and neat. Everything's nice and clean. And that is supposed to be a building where a massacre has just occurred. Why did the gunman need his video camera? Why did he need 2 print sports bags? Also consider that there were live .308 rounds found on the floor inside the cafe. The only weapon used inside the cafe was the AR-15, which uses .223 ammunition. But in the boot of the Volvo were several hundred .308 rounds. So how did these .308 rounds end up inside the cafe? At this stage, I should also point out 2 other little discrepancies that have occurred within the story of this massacre. The first is that the current affair program showed a person running down the road towards the buses and inferred that this person was the gunman. Nothing could be further from the truth. This person is running, and the gunman never ran. This person is dressed completely differently to the gunman and is carrying blankets from the information centre to the wounded at the buses, and is, in all probability, Mark Kirby, one of the many at the site who assisted so admirably after the massacre. The video is genuine. It is the portrayal of this video that is not.
Still standing there looking at it. He walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
But the killing spree continued. 2 minutes later, there were 20 dead and nearly as many wounded.
The other discrepancy is the missing boat. The aerial shot of Port Arthur that has been bandied about, supposedly stating that there's no boat in the area immediately inside the jetty area of Port Arthur, is again misleading. All a person has to do is look at the right of the picture and he or she will see 2 boats. The larger boat being the supposedly missing boat. The video taken by James Velasco was taken at extreme zoom, which is why the boat appears closer than it actually was. And any person who watches cricket, football or any of the sports on television would be aware of this. Now that's the end of part 1. Would anybody... Dennis?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Andrew. Does anybody have any questions concerning what has been talked about so far? Not the information that's coming, but specifically what was covered. Yes.
Tony Pitt. Tony Pitt. The one thing that puzzles me, if this guy running away was so-and-so, the photo at the Volvo is very clearly Martin Bryant, or a guy with long hair. And who was doing the shooting if it wasn't Martin Bryant? Now, the guy's running away, he goes to the Volvo and he shoots at the cameraman.
That's the next section, I'm afraid, Tony.
Oh, right. Okay, that's what I want to see explained, because I see a guy running away, he starts shooting at the cameraman, and the cameraman has shown him to be a fellow with long hair. Who's doing the shooting?
Thank you, Tony.
One of the things we should point out is that the person with long hair at the Volvo was the gunman. That particular videotape was taken by James Velasco at extreme zoom. However, the Wilkinsons also took a very similar videotape from a different angle. It's not as clear as James Velasco's, but you can still see the gunman there, and you can see the Volvo drive out. There's only one shot fired at James Velasco.
Thank you, Andrew. There are no other questions at the moment. we'll ask Andrew to continue with the second section. Thank you, Andrew.
Hang on, I've stepped up a little bit too. I'm going to miss that part. I'll speak to you later on, if I may, Tony. I shall now move on to the next part of the massacre and touch very briefly on Constable Chris Isles of Sorrel. Chris Isles had been the Newbena policeman for about 12 years and had been transferred to Sorrel about 6 months prior to the massacre. And his replacement at Newbena was Constable Paul Hyland. Many people are aware that Constable Paul Hyland and Gary Whittle of Denali were at Saltwater River when they received a radio message at 13:38 hours that there had been a shooting at Port Arthur. However, Jim Laycock states that within 3 minutes of Zoe Hall being murdered and Glenn Pearce being kidnapped outside the Broad Arrow store, which was at approximately 1:45 p.m, Constable Chris Isles had arrived at the scene in a marked police vehicle. Laycock's statement is corroborated by another witness, Kyle Spruce. Then Constable Chris Isles took off in pursuit of the gunman and was never heard of again within the events that constitute the Port Arthur massacre. Questions must arise regarding what Constable Chris Isles was doing out of his area on this quiet Sunday afternoon, and the fact that he never appears to be utilised, especially when the survivors at the Port Arthur site were required to wait for 6 hours before they received proper police presence. Again, having been the local Port Arthur policeman for 12 years, Constable Isles knew all the locals, the staff of Port Arthur and the emergency crews that were utilised to perform the various police duties for the police that were held back from attending at the site due to the dangers presented to the police. So Chris Isles vanishes, and then Constable Hyland and Gary Whittle attend to Port Arthur, and then on to Seascape. However, there is another policeman to enter the scene. Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty from Bellarive Police Station has arrived at the scene. Sergeant Fogarty is also a team leader with the SOG. Both Hyland and Whittle state that when they arrived at Seascape, the BMW was already burning at the front, and when the fire reached the back section of the vehicle, it exploded. Martin Bryant, in his police interview, states that he was knocking at the back door of Seascape when the BMW exploded, but also confuses himself by saying that he must have been burnt by the fire that destroyed the BMW. Martin Bryant also believes that the hostage died in the BMW fire. Now consider this. One of the task force members investigating the Port Arthur massacre has stated to witnesses that it was the SOG who set fire to the BMW, so as to negate its use to the persons inside Seascape as a means of escape. This means that if the BMW was already burning on the arrival of Hyland and Whittle at Seascape, then the only reported SOG member at the scene at that time was Sergeant Fogarty, and therefore Fogarty would have had to have been the SOG member who set the BMW alight. The police task force member also stated that it was the same SOG member who set fire to Seascape Cottage, using the same means as with the BMW, that is, by firing a phosphorus grenade into the building. This grenade apparently went through the attic window facing onto the Arthur Highway. In his statement, Andrew Fogarty states that he fired off 2 illuminating flares over Seascape, but under the orders of Sergeant Morrison. Both Hyland and Whittle state that they saw a naked person run into the Seascape Cottage, Hyland stating that it was a black-haired person, and Whittle stating it was a female. There is no proof that the person that these constables saw was the one and the same, but it is fair enough to consider that it was. What we do know, though, is that this black-haired naked person was not Martin Bryant, nor would it have been the gunman. So who was she? Then we have Constable Allen stating that at one stage, just before dark, the gunman was spotted on the roof of an adjoining building, and he needed to be identified before the SOG marksman could shoot the offender. Constable Allen stated that when he put his head up out of the culvert to take a view of the gunman on the roof, he was shot at. The bullet striking the front bumper bar of the police car he was behind. Now this gives us two items of information. One, that the person shooting at Allen was listening to the police communications. And two, that the gunman on the roof was not the person shooting at Constable Allen. Sergeant Fogarty would never have permitted a gunman in his sights to actually shoot another policeman. It has been noted that Sergeant Fogarty's brother, Michael Fogarty, who is also a member of the Tasmania Police SOG, shot and killed Joe Gillowitz in 1991, when their father, Superintendent Fogarty, was in charge of the Tasmania Police SOG. Superintendent Fogarty, I believe, was also in charge of the SOG in 96. Now, this incident with the shot at Constable Allen sparked off two other incidents. The first was with the SES and Fire Brigade members who had been monitoring the police communications. A fire truck did the rounds of Port Arthur, warning the personnel there that the gunman was on the loose and heading this way. This created absolute panic at Port Arthur site because there was still no protection for them from any police. The second incident was that the police commander, Assistant Commissioner Lupo Prinz, called in assistance from the Victoria Police SOG and then notified the National Crisis Centre in Canberra of their terrorist attack. I beg your pardon, terrorist situation. All this action by the Tasmania Police was as per the SOG manual prepared by SACPAV. Does anybody know what SACPAV is? That's, what is it, the Standing Advisory Committee on the Prevention Against Violence. It's a federal-placed body that controls the police SOGs, and in the SACPAV anti-terrorist plan that had been implemented in November 1995, now the SACPAV have control of various police state SOG bodies, but not only that, they also have trained other members of the police, such as the police media liaison officers. However, what is of real interest is the fact that the SACPAV is run by the Protective Security Coordination Centre, the PSCC, which is an intelligence body operating out of both the Federal Attorney General's Department and the Justice Department. It has also been recorded that the police special branches were also being run by the PSCC. We have been informed by a current affair that the three top Tasmania policemen, McCready, Prinz and Bennett, are all SACPAV trained. So was their immediate liaison officer, Jeff Easton, who prior to his appointment with the Tasmania Police was a communications officer at Canberra. Another immediate liaison officer was Peter Hazelwood, who has connections with the Hilton Hotel bombing back in 1978. This was the event that initiated the formation of SACPAV and the PSCC. Peter Hazelwood is ASIO. What other bodies are connected with SACPAV? ASIO is, for a start, and of course the military. Then there is the Australian Federal Police, many of whose officers end up in the PSCC, the Australian Protective Service, which is an offshoot of the Australian Federal Police and is also seen as another intelligence service, which, by the way, is responsible for the security at the Woomera Base, where rioting and illegal immigrants were treated with force outside that is considered proper by normal police forces. The Department of Foreign Affairs, and the list goes on, even to include bodies from New Zealand. But back to Tasmania and the siege at Seascape. By Monday morning, with the media from all over the world now focusing on Port Arthur, the Pink Palace, as the locals called Seascape Cottage, is set alight. By Martin Bryant, we are told, except for a task force member who states that it was by Sergeant Fogarty. This, of course, destroyed all the evidence that was to be found inside Seascape Cottage, except for the two murder weapons, which were found outside Seascape in a badly damaged state. as the police had been informed by Jamie inside Seascape during the siege. But the only person to emerge from the fire was Martin Bryant, who was arrested, handcuffed and placed in the back of an ambulance and conveyed to the Royal Hobart Hospital. Now consider these two statements made by CNN's John Radler, based in Sydney. He attended a Port Arthur along with another CNN employee, Hugh Williams, of Sydney, but based in Berlin and at home at the time on leave. The first statement. Johnson's, which is Superintendent Johnson, Jack Johnson, explanation of the fate of the macaques was the classic win-win soundbite. 2. This is certainly the case in CNN's coverage of the Port Arthur massacre, vis-a-vis the Tasmania police. They came across as in control, competent, professional, effective and thorough. They got the culprit, got him reasonably quickly, got him alive and kept him alive. They built an ultimately overwhelming case against him. And they did all of this in the midst of what were, for all of them, uniquely challenging circumstances. Break 2. Questions?
Would anybody like to speak on these uniquely challenging circumstances? Yes, Tony.
It's Tony Pitt again. I've been thinking, and back in the video we had 17 shots in roughly 20 seconds. 15 seconds, okay. Now, I was twice in the winning team in the national titles pistol, and I came in 5th in the Queen's Medal with the rifle. Now, I did a quick tally, and at that shooting rate, in 4.5 minutes, we would have shot about 240 rounds of ammunition. There's a discrepancy between the 4.5 minutes and the number of shots. So, you know, I can handle the 17 shots, but I can't handle the 4.5 minutes. So could you just fix me up on that one?
Right, all right. Now, I said the minimum shots fired. Now, this is shots where people have been killed or injured, 41. I'm not talking about all the others that missed. For a start, the gunman fired off the first round, the first magazine, changed magazines in the gift shop and continued firing. On completion of shooting Jason Winter, who was the last person shot, the gunman then went to the door and reloaded, and then stepped out onto the balcony and continued down to the car park. I have no idea how many shots were fired. People keep on telling me, including Vietnam vets, about 50 to 60 rounds were fired inside the cafe. I've only been able to calculate 41. But I haven't been in there to see all the bullet holes, all the matter sort of thing that say the bullets would have dragged onto the roof, on the walls and anywhere else. But I can tell you this much. There are only 7 particles of bullets found inside the cafe by the New South Wales forensic team. And the New South Wales forensic team are the best forensic team in Australia. They only found 7. They didn't look very well.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, Don. At the time of the massacre, the news media told us that Martin Bryant was holed up in Seascape, and it was situated in the middle of a cleared paddock, was unapproachable, and he was firing a large number of rounds, and they couldn't approach it. Would you comment on that?
Seascape Cottage was on the south side of Long Bay. It's got water on one side. It has the Arthur Highway on the other. The Long Bay goes almost to the edge of the Tasman Highway. On the other side of the Tasman Highway is an extremely steep hill. The police, 2 police were on the road in a culvert. An SOG member gone up to a local building, Ben Bullen I think it was called, came down through the scrub and were situated slightly above that culvert to keep an eye on. The They had police to the north on a small strip of land, there's a lot of small vegetation, which was good cover. On the south side, there's another reasonably open paddock, but there were some trees. There was some cover, and two different teams of 2 members from the Tasmania Police SSG had been stationed on the south side. The road was above Seascape Cottage, just looking down, going down into the gully. The Seascape Cottage had been built on the flat just right at the water's edge. It was a very beautiful, very scenic screen, and it's a very easily defended area.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, sir.
That's better. I'd just like you to go over the relationship with the Tasmanian SOG again for us a little bit slowly. I think you mentioned something like father and son teams or some sort of incestuous relationship here. If you could just run through that a little slowly and step by step, I'd appreciate that greatly. Thank you.
It's not incestuous, it's despotic. The father was Superintendent Fogarty. Superintendent Fogarty appeared at the Royal Commission held in Hobart last year in relation to the Gillowitz shooting. And when he was there, his solicitor jumped up with a stat deck was made out by the head of the PSCC, who was a lawyer with neither military nor police training. That's Superintendent Fogarty. He had 2 sons who were in the police force. Mark Fogarty, who shot and killed Joe Gillowitz in 1991, who was in the SOG, and his brother, Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty, who was also a team leader in the SOG and was a uniformed sergeant stationed at Belrive Police Station.
Thank you, sir. Would you just leave it alone as it is now, please? Thank you.
Andrew, can you just run the bit by me again? The local policeman of 12 years at Port Arthur that disappeared. Just run that by me again a little bit slower, please.
Constable Chris Isles had been a policeman for 12 years, but 6 months before Port Arthur had transferred to Sorell. He was very well known in the area, a big lad, apparently he's bigger than I am. On the Sunday, this not quite Sunday, he was in the area. There is no sign whatsoever of any communications. He's not mentioned in any document whatsoever, except the statements by Jim Laycock, Kyle Spruce, and an Asian gentleman whose name I have forgotten, but he was hiding in a cemetery or something behind the store, who saw the police car go off down the road with lights and sirens flashing. But he was there, he went down the road. Now the biggest problem I have is there's only 4 to 5 k's from the Port Arthur General Store to Seascape Cottage. And there is no road off. They've got a few drive-ins to holiday homes and some caravan park, and there wasn't any sign of him even driving past the Fox and Hounds Hotel. He's completely vanished. We don't know, we've seen nothing, but we've got the statement that he was there. And that's extremely illuminating. That information has been suppressed.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, last question, sir.
Any of the bullets or the cartridge cases that were found, were they subsequently linked by forensics to any particular weapons?
I haven't read Sergeant Derek Dutton. Sergeant Derek Dutton did a 200-page report, ballistics report, and I haven't got that. However, both firearms were badly damaged. I doubt if you could link the AR-15 because the bullet exploded in the breech. It would have created damage to the breech, so I doubt if they could link the actual cartridge case. The FN, again, was badly damaged, but I haven't seen anything where it actually was, though I would presume that it would be. Sergeant Dutton, sort of thing. It was a competent and honest policeman. Most of Sergeant Dutton, Sergeant McCarthy, the police negotiator, most of the people involved in this will be extremely honest and diligent policemen. There's only a couple of players sort of thing that you must really start questioning.
Thank you. And
one comment. If a bullet explodes in the breach, somebody wears the bits of breach.
Thank you. Would you like to comment or leave that?
That's right out of my field, Tony.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. If you carry on with section 3.
Right, thank you. The Tasmania Police set up a task force under Superintendent Johnston to investigate the Port Arthur massacre. A member of that task force, Inspector Maxwell, travelled to Victoria and spoke to a Bill Drysdale of Yass in relation to one of the murder weapons, the AR-15. Bill Drysdale identified that firearm by the gunsmith's mark on the barrel. Furthermore, this particular firearm had been handed to the Victoria Police at Lilydale in 1993, when that particular firearm had been made illegal. However, the AR-15 firearms that had been handed into the Victoria Police during this amnesty were then issued to the Victoria Police SOG as weapons until they were issued with new weapons in 1994. And these AR-15s were then sold to a Bendigo gun dealer for sale overseas. Apparently, Tasmania is overseas. Except for one. The compact AR-15, or the carbine AR-15, that had once been the property of Bill Drysdale. It went through the police books as being destroyed at the Sims Metal Furnace, but somehow ended up in Tasmania at the Seascape Cottage after the siege. However, this damaged AR-15 could not have been the weapon used at Port Arthur. It was damaged by blowing up around inside the breach. The creation of this damage also creates a loud explosion, enough to deafen a person for up to a couple of days. Please note that Martin Bryant's hearing was not affected when he was arrested at Seascape. Also note that all the police statements during the siege tell of the various weapons being fired, which they could differentiate by the sounds alone. And when the fire took place, they could also tell the difference between exploding ammunition and shots being fired. But not one mention is made of an extremely loud explosion that must have occurred when the AR-15 was damaged. Thus, the only conclusion was that this weapon was damaged prior to the siege, and thus prior to the massacre. The other weapon used during the massacre was an FNS SLR, of which Martin Bryant denied ever owning. Mind you, the firearm that was suddenly found in the piano at Bryant's Clare Street residence, an Australian Arms semi-automatic .223, is never mentioned in the only police interview that took place on the 4th of July. So much for Independence Day. That was a short one. Now come on. Tony?
Yes.
Interesting.
So, your question, please.
Just one question related to these fires. There was, you stated that the SOG men fired flares, but you've also mentioned phosphorus grenades for the house and the car, right? Now, would it be normal to issue phosphorus grenades to an SOG man? And if so, would he just sort of carry them around in case he might ever happen to need them?
I've got a big worry about that last one. All right, the task force member said phosphorus grenades. Sergeant Fogarty's statement says illuminating flares. Now, they may be one and the same. I've been out the police force a little bit too long. I've never used these items of equipment. I do know policemen normally do not carry such things in the boot of their police vehicle. The other extremely interesting fact, which I haven't mentioned, is Constable Paul Hyland's statement states that the Seascape Cottage area was illuminated by a street-type lighting. Now, if you have street-type lighting in the area, why would you need to fire off illuminating flares?
Yes, sir.
cases which were removed from the various shootings. Could that have happened to prove that if there were two guns used in the shooting, you would forensically be able to identify the cases with two guns? If a whole series of guns was used, you could prove by the cases when they expand in the different chamber sizes and with different chamber marks that they were fired in different guns. So the removal of the bullet cases could in fact be removing the evidence. And in fact destroying the chambers of both guns would then not be able to tie in the cases that were found with the guns that were allegedly used. Does that make sense?
right over my head.
In any bullet case, once extracted, you can ascertain which gun it was fired in.
Yes.
Right. So if a whole lot of different guns were used, you'd have a whole lot of different cases which would have been obviously fired from different guns.
The interesting fact is that apparently 15 firearms were destroyed in the burning of Seascape Cottage. Now, we're told that the guns there belonged to the son, Glenn Martin. I don't know gun nut yet who would keep his firearms at his parents' house, you know, an hour and a half away from home. Secondly, Glenn Martin, in an article printed in the Melbourne Sunday Herald Sun, states quite emphatically his parents didn't have any firearms on the property. He didn't have any. So where did the firearms come from? Martin Bryant didn't have them. The police never interviewed Martin Bryant about the Australian Arms semi-automatic that was found in the piano at his property. Never touched that subject. Martin Bryant always admits he owned 3 firearms: the AR-10, the AR-15 and the Daewoo shotgun. Martin Bryant also states quite specifically that the AR-10 and the Daewoo shotgun frightened him when he used them because he was a left-handed shooter. And especially with the AR-10, if he had fired it from the left shoulder, he'd quite easily end up wearing one very hot cartridge down his thing, and it would burn him. And that explains why Martin Bryant was quite frightened of these things backfiring or ricocheting out. But he really liked the AR-15.
Thank you, Andrew. By the way, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Don't think that people will know or whatever. It's an unusual opportunity. Make sure you take it. Yes, sir.
I'm unaware of whether the police found any spent projectiles in the cafe, but one would think that there would have to be spent projectiles either lodged in the wall or in the persons of the victims. Now, it's a simple matter to match those projectiles with the alleged rifles that were so conveniently not burnt at Seascape. Even if the chamber is damaged, the barrels could be cut off a foot back from the end and a blank projectile forced through the barrel with a high tensile rod to imprint the rifling on it, and then they could be compared. Do you know if that comparison or those tests have ever been done?
Gerard Dutton has never informed me. One of the things I do know is the Americans asked him, sort of thing, if they had any actual evidence that did definitely link Martin Bryant to the cafe. Gerard Dutton replied, no.
Thank you. Yes, Ted.
You mentioned one picture had 2 boats, one had 1. Does that indicate that you think whoever they were escaped in one of those boats?
No, not at all. The video taken by James Velasca shows 1 boat. When you have a look at the area photograph, there are 2 boats, and on the right side there are 2 different boats, but they are separated, and the larger boat is the boat that appears on the video. So the 2 boats both stayed there, but only one was able to be viewed on that particular video.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes.
Yes, I read a book by a fellow called Joe Vialis, and I later spoke to him, and I actually met his wife. What I believed from there, and have been telling various people, is that there were 29 shots fired, with leaving one shot in the breach, and then he, having killed like 20 people or something with those shots, and then put in another magazine. From what you said, I haven't sort of quite figured if you believe that is not the case, that he didn't shoot 20 people in 30 seconds or something of that nature.
20 people, 4.5 minutes. 2 magazines used. I don't know how many shots were actually fired. 2 magazines. The figures of 29 and 90 seconds were invented by the DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, to protect the Tasmanian government from any action in relation to a duty of care and responsibility to a locked or a broken fire exit door. Mind you, it's extremely interesting, the rumour that states that the authority was so incompetent, the one thing they didn't have covered under their insurance was murder-suicide.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, madam, if you have a question, could you pop up to the mic, please? I wonder if you could pop up to the mic. You get it recorded that way, you see. That's why the mic's there. It's important to make sure that the question is heard as well as the answer. Thank you, madam.
Whose fingerprints were on the video camera?
I'm not told, but I believe at least one person, one survivor from the Port Arthur Cafe did handle it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
There was you explained that there was 2 fellows that indicated there was 4.5 or 5 minutes time during the shooting. Is that correct?
No, there's several more.
Several more. You only mentioned 2. One said 5.
There's Wendy Skur.
Wendy Skur said tonight she wasn't sure. She said the shooting started just before 7:30 and it finished a minute and a half after.
No, 7:30 p.m., 6:30 p.m. 3 shots were fired. The shooting inside the cafe, is that what you're talking about?
The witnesses that you're using to establish that there was about 5 minutes lapsed time while the shooting was going on, yet the video cameras say something different.
No, the video camera records shots fired in 15 seconds. Another video camera continues on till 25 seconds. Once stopped, the shooting could have continued on for another 5 seconds, 5 minutes or 5 days, because there is no evidence to state the exact time.
That were questioned in relation to the time, the 4.5 minute fellow and the 5 minute fellow.
No, there's not 2. I've got 2 Vietnam vets. I have Wendy Skur. I have Major Sandra Vanderpeer. And there's most probably would be a couple of others. In the article that was printed in the Hobart Mercury about Wendy Skur coming to Inverell, there was 2 replies. One was anonymous, another one was from the person who managed a cafe near the Port Arthur site. They both confirmed the shooting within the cafe also took approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Just a very quick one. Were there any fingerprints identifying Martin Bryant on any of the cartridges found? Or the guns?
According to Gerard Stark reply to the Americans, no.
Thank you.
Headquarters in Hobart to obtain information about the shooting of Port Arthur, they were surprised to find that they were not the first to arrive at the media liaison officer. Mr. Roland Brown, the spokesperson for the gun control in Tasmania, had beaten them to it. Now this surely must be a coincidence. But there were other coincidences that do stand out. Helicopter pilots were normally a scarcity on a Sunday afternoon. Normally it is difficult even to locate one. But on this particular Sunday, they were able to obtain the services of 3 helicopter pilots. For the ambulance staff, the possible staff shortage was overcome by utilising staff and volunteers that were attending courses for that Sunday afternoon. The Southern District Mortuary Service even had a 22-body hearse waiting to be used for such an emergency. It was the only one of its kind in Australia, and it was stuck in the southern part of Tasmania, right on call. However, it was the Royal Hobart Hospital that demonstrated the height of preparedness. They were able to call on the services of 25 trauma specialist doctors from all over Australia, who had just completed a seminar at the midday on that Sunday afternoon, and whose last lecture had been in relation to a terrorist attack. Oh dear. It was the EMA, the Emergency Management Australia Port Arthur seminar papers, that demonstrated the preparedness of all these bodies, especially with the Royal Hobart Hospital and its newly completed Code Brown emergency plan. But we are then given another clue. The coroner, Ian Matheson, the staff at the Royal Hobart Hospital, including some doctors and many ambulance service personnel, initially believed it was simply another exercise. And some ignored the cause until they heard on the news, on the radio and television. In other words, these people had been conditioned to attending exercises until they were sick and tired of them. In his book, Suddenly One Sunday, journalist Mike Bingham wrote, "Involvement in these national and local exercises was to prove invaluable as Tasmania Police set about managing the Port Arthur massacre. The responses were to work so well that there were times when it all seemed like an exercise, despite the enormity of it all." The Tasmania Police did all of that? They weren't there for 6.5 bloody hours. So who was responsible for these people to be so prepared for such a tragedy? In Tasmania, the emergency exercises were the responsibility of the SES, the State Emergency Service. This body is attached to the Tasmania Police, and the Police Commissioner is the Deputy Chairman of the State Emergency Service. However, these bodies are controlled by the Canberra-based SACPAV, the Standing Advisory Committee on States and Commonwealth for the Protection Against Violence. The SACPAV subcommittee, the project group training, the PGT, is responsible for the training and exercise programs run by SACPAV. But then again, SACPAV is controlled by the PSCC, the intelligence agency. There is, however, one last seminar to consider, and that is unique in that it was the first, the only ever seminar to be held for the top 10 personnel at the Port Arthur Historic Site. And it was to be held on the 28th and 29th of April 1996. What was this seminar about? Nothing. By the time these particular staff members arrived at Swansea, the massacre had occurred and everybody went straight back to the site to assist. Next one.
Yes, do we have any questions about some of those fascinating coincidences?
Not one question about Roland Brown.
Andrew, is there something else you want to say about the gentleman?
What happens with Roland Brown, once Roland Brown is at the Police Information Centre, it is no longer an information centre, it's now been made a propaganda centre. It's as simple as that. Port Arthur was in fact, at the very fact, a media exercise. The media were catered for in every possible way. The human beings, the volunteers and everybody else at Port Arthur were totally ignored.
Thank you, Andrew. If you could carry on with the last section 5.
But back to Martin Bryant, who has been arrested by the SOG and conveyed to the Royal Hobart Hospital. On Tuesday the 30th of April 1996, police endeavoured to interview Martin Bryant in the presence of a hospital doctor, but Bryant wishes to have nothing to do with them, and so he is simply charged with one count of murder, that of Kate Scott. On the following day, Martin Bryant was again interviewed, but not by police. Dr. Ian Sale. In notes taken by the prison officer guarding Martin Bryant, Sir Blavel, Sale states to Bryant, "Whatever you say to us may be used against you in court. Do you understand what I said?" Consider the implications of this evidence, if this evidence is correct. Dr. Sale has just stated that he is collecting evidence to use against Martin Bryant in a court of law. Yet his reports form part of the basis of Mullen's report, which was the only evidence used by the defence in the sentencing of Martin Bryant. Bryant was interviewed by Dr. Sale on the 1st and the 3rd of May, and then by Mullen on the 5th of May. During each of these interviews, apparently the same prison officer was present and apparently took notes. This raises questions due to who had custody of Bryant at the time. Bryant should have been under police guard until he was lodged at Risdon Prison. And we have a policewoman stating that she was at one stage required to perform guard duty on Bryant. Again, the same prison officer took note of the conversation between Martin Bryant and Petra Wilmot on the 15th of May at Risdon Prison. In fact, up until the police interview, the only contributor to confessional evidence is that by this one officer. In late August, another prison officer gives evidence, but on the whole there are many errors within these confessional statements. In his report on Martin Bryant that was read at the Supreme Court on the 20th of November 1996, Mullen refers to the fact that Martin Bryant was put on a guardianship order by the Hobart Court in October 1993. That the case was actually heard in camera, which is private, by the judge on the 22nd of April 1994 was not mentioned by Mullen, nor was the fact that the application was brought under the Mental Health Act, or the fact that Bryant was represented by solicitors from the firm Griffiths and Jackson of Hobart, due to the simple fact that Martin Bryant was not present at the court on that day, because he was in London. What the guardianship order states emphatically, and this is something that the learned professor should have been well aware of, was that the court considered Martin Bryant, due to his mental inability, was not competent to make any plea in relation to the charges which he was facing in November 1996. Not only that, but the Chief Justice, Mr. William Cox, would also have been well aware of that little problem. Oh dear me. However, back to Professor Mullen. In 2000, that's last year, Mullen, along with another psychiatrist, Christopher H. Cantor, and another gentleman, Philip Albers, wrote an article titled Mass Homicide, the Civil Massacre, in which they used 7 lone nut gunman type massacres to prove their findings. These cases are 1. Julian Knight, Melbourne in 1987. 2. Michael Ryan, Hungerford, England, 1987. 3. Frank Victovich, Melbourne, 1987. 4. David Gray, Aramamina in New Zealand in 1990. 5. Wade Franken, Strathfield in 1991. 6. Thomas Hamilton, Dunblane, Scotland in 1996. And 7. Martin Bryant, Port Arthur, 1996. These 7 massacres are all seemingly related by circumstances, besides the fact that they were used specifically to introduce firearm control by the governments of the day. Christopher H. Cantor is a psychiatrist affiliated with the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention program at Griffith University, and is the author of several anti-firearm articles going back to at least 1991. Philip Albers has penned similar articles. One would have to wonder if these persons have any links with either the Australian Institute of Criminology or the National Committee Against Violence. Professor Mullen is stated in this article as having interviewed Julian Knight and Martin Bryant after the events and resided in the area affected by Gray. In fact, we are aware that Mullen's report on Bryant was the only psychiatric report presented to the Supreme Court, which makes Mullen more than just an interviewer of Bryant. There are two aspects worth considering in this article before I delve any further into it. In every case except Frankham and Bryant, the only weapons used were firearms. However, both Frankham and Bryant lost a parent prior to their massacres by suicide. Both Frankham and Bryant not only used high-powered firearms, but a large knife and handcuffs as well. The use of handcuffs in any lone nut gunman-style massacre is uniquely Australian. The perpetrators of such crimes do not intend to constrain victims, but rather murder anybody within their sights. Yet we are informed that whilst at Seascape, Martin Bryant, also known as Jamie, had information regarding his hostage Glenn Pearce that would have only come from an interrogation. For Martin Bryant, though, this would have been a virtual impossibility, considering his stated mental ability. Is this simple a coincidence? I would doubt it. There are other coincidences. The last sentence in the report on Julian Knight states, JK's subsequent course in prison has made any psychotic condition highly unlikely. But obsessional personality traits and narcissism have become more obvious. The obvious question here is that if Julian Knight is no longer a threat to our society, then why was he a threat on the 9th of August 1987 when he murdered 7 persons and attempted to murder another 17? In the report on Frank Viktorovich, it states that this person, who obviously had a long-standing fascination with firearms, obtained an M1 carbine .30 calibre semi-automatic military-style firearm with a sawn-off barrel and a shortened stock. Mind you, these alterations were made so the weapon would fit into the bag, which was used to carry the weapon to the scene of the massacre, and completely destroys the statement that Viktorovich had a fascination with firearms, as any student of weaponry would know that by cutting off the end of the barrel removed the gas pressure that caused the firearm to automatically reload. This meant that to create the massacre, Viktorovich had to manually reload the rifle after each shot. Moreover, this created the possibility for the weapon to jam should the reloading action become jerky, which is exactly what happened with this particular incident, and enabled 2 men to actually take hold of Viktorovich before he apparently broke loose and jumped through a plate glass window and fell to his death 11 floors below. But what is extremely interesting is that 2 persons who, by sheer coincidence, happened to view the massacre from the building directly opposite. The then State Attorney General, Jim Cannon, and the Police Minister, Race Matthews. These 2 Labor Party politicians were part of the push in Victoria to introduce their tough new firearm laws. And it is by sheer coincidence that they just happened to be in the building where Jim Cannon's extremely secure offices were located on the 20th to 23rd floors. However, at the time of this incident, I am reliably informed that they were at a typing pool located on the 12th floor, with the massacre taking place in the building directly opposite on the 11th floor. Another interesting bit of trivia given to us by this report is that during his killing spree, Frank Viktorovich was heard making some rather startling comments, including, "How do they expect me to kill people with this gun?" Just exactly what did Viktorovich mean by that statement, and who were they? It was very shortly after this massacre that a special Premier's meeting was called in Hobart, where national firearm laws were the agenda. But the plan was defeated due to Tasmania and South Australia not accepting the federal incursion into the state's constitutional powers. This was when Premier Barry Unsworth made his now famous quote of, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania." Please remember that in cases where the constitutions are involved, each and every state must accept the amendment. If any state declines, then the federal constitution amendment cannot continue. It's a backdoor way of avoiding a referendum. In the case report on Martin Bryant, this article has made some astounding statements. It states that the killings began with the murder of an elderly couple against whom Bryant's family held a long-standing grudge. This is not correct. There was never any grudge between the Bryant and Martin family. Mrs. Bryant denies it totally. So does Glenn Martin. The report continues. He believes that this long-standing grudge had contributed to the suicide of his father. No, never. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Martin Bryant believed that actions by the Martin had led to his father committing suicide 13 years later. The report states that this incident occurred only 6 weeks after Dunblane. That is correct. But there is not one mention of Dunblane in Mullen's report on Bryant, presented to the Hobart Supreme Court. This is highly irregular. Furthermore, when the report states that there have been suggestions that Martin Bryant may have been influenced by the 2 Melbourne incidents, being cases 1 and 3, there is no written report presented to the Supreme Court to follow this line of thinking. There is, however, evidence from a prison officer stating that Bryant considered himself worse than Ivan Milat, but the context of that statement remains unclear. I think you'll find that Martin Bryant was extremely upset that he had killed children. He considered the things he supposedly done was so evil that it was worse than Ivan Milat. The report states that a number of psychological assessments over the years failed to reach agreements as to diagnosis. The highly eminent Dr. Cunningham Dax stated that Bryant may be developing an illness of a schizophrenic type in an assessment in 1984. In 1991, Drs. Mather and MP McCartney diagnosed a schizophrenic illness. In 1994, Bryant has action brought against him by 2 doctors concerned about his apparent frittering away his inheritance under the Mental Health Act, and succeeds in having the Hobart Supreme Court place Martin Bryant under a guardianship. Mrs. Bryant states that her son is suffering from schizophrenia, as does his girlfriend Petra Wilmont. Mrs. Bryant refers to her son's psychiatrist, Dr. Rushton, who for some unknown reason is never mentioned in Mullen's report to the Supreme Court. However, it is only Dr. Sale and Professor Mullen who argue that Martin Bryant is not schizophrenic. The report goes on with numerous inconsistencies, especially in regards to Martin Bryant, but let me make one last comparison. In the closing paragraph of Mullen's report that was presented to Judge William Cox in the sentencing of Martin Bryant, Mullen writes, Mr. Bryant currently does not have the signs and the symptoms of a mental illness. He is, however, by virtue of his personality and intellectual limitations, both of reduced coping ability and of increased psychological vulnerability, it is possible that under the combined stress of lengthy incarceration and having to live with the memories and consequences of his awful acts, that he may, in the future, break down into frank mental illness. It will be necessary to continually monitor his state of mind during his future containment and initiate appropriate treatment if and when it is required. Now compare that little gem with this one previously mentioned regarding Julian Knight that stated, Julian Knight was examined by a number of psychiatrists and psychologists. Although a pre-psychotic condition was suggested, the predominant opinion was of a narcissistic young man involved in his world of fantasy. Julian Knight's subsequent course in prison has made any psychotic condition highly unlikely, but obsessional and personality traits and narcissism have become more obvious. What this article by Cantor, Mullen and Alpers does is emphasise the requirement for Australia's new firearm laws was demonstrated by 4 unique low-nut gunman-type massacres in Australia. The uniqueness of these criminal acts does not simply stop at the cause and effect within Australia, but also the time slot that these crimes fall into. It was only after the ideology created the need for firearms to be removed from our society that these unique crimes erupted. Furthermore, when two of the main persons involved in the implementation of this new ideology actually were able to witness one of only 4 such events in Australia, we must consider that as extremely coincidental. One last break. How are we going? What is... Oh, 9:30. No, I'm going fine. Probably could have missed out at 9 o'clock. I'm sorry about that.
Yes, sir, your question.
Yes, in the beginning, I think Wendy mentioned the coal mines and said that would be brought up later and it was important. I just wondered if... I haven't heard anything.
Wendy hadn't seen my speech. The coal mines were important in the fact that they were used to lure away the only known police presence in the area.
Thank you, sir.
In passing, you mentioned the chap being pushed out the window or getting through a plate glass window. How well prepared would a photographer have to be to get that picture the TV showed with him halfway down?
Say again?
You'd have to have it all set, ready to go. Doesn't take a man long to fall 2 stories.
11 floors. He apparently had been clinging onto the... After diving through the window, which had previously been, we'll say, broken by a bullet going through it, Frank Victovic then apparently clung to the balcony outside the window for approximately 4 minutes before falling to his death. What type of person jumps through a window to commit suicide and then stops halfway and says, hang on, I've changed my mind?
Yes, sir.
I think what you've said about all the things at Port Arthur are very important, that sort of thing, and since there's no media representation here or anything to sort of repeat what you said, I'd have a tough time telling what you said to my friends and that sort of thing. Is there any sort of pamphlets or a website even, like any... Okay.
So Andrew
I was just curious.
Published a book. He's put the book on a CD-ROM. And this way you can see far more than what you would normally get from a book. It'll be available for sale tonight.
Just quickly, that'll sort of be passing in circulation about people that care about these sort of things. In there where I live, this sort of stuff just doesn't get out there, what you've been saying. We just take on what the media tells us, that sort of thing. Is there something like a... Because, you know, I'd do a pamphlet drop and that sort of thing, you know.
Look, I come from Geelong, down in Victoria. Its nickname is Sleepy Hollow. I know exactly what you're talking about. The information is there. Also, my speech here tonight is in there, plus a few other little items. You'll find them rather interesting. The only unfortunate problem is I keep on getting more and more information.
Yes, sir.
Well, here's a bit more.
Is this a question?
Well, you know, like the Senate, you know, like you make a statement in the form of a question, but it's a question, yeah, so please don't jump on me. Most of the people here, we watched the media presentation as it unfolded, and I do recall that Martin Bryant had a lawyer, and initially this lawyer was in the media saying he'll plead not guilty, which of course means a trial and presentation of evidence and witnesses and all that stuff. Now, I saw after he got his new lawyer, and the new lawyer said, oh, we're going to plead guilty, I saw on Channel 10 his first lawyer make this statement, words to this effect: there's some things about this trial that the Australian people should know, but I'm not allowed to tell you. Have you heard anything along those lines?
I didn't hear that one. But I've got a couple of little things going on to the trial of Martin Bryant, and also about his lawyer, his lawyer, John Avery. I am aware that the initial lawyer, David Gunson, stepped aside and let Martin Bryant be handled by John Avery when John Avery was incompetent. He had a conflict of interest in that he was also been previously representing Terry Hill, who was supposedly the person who supplied Martin Bryant with the firearms. You can't do that. The thing is, after the sentencing of Martin Bryant, there was another court hearing where Bryant's property was confiscated by the Crown. And on this particular occasion, Martin Bryant was again represented by David Gunson. David Gunson never stood down, he simply stepped aside.
Thank you. Your question, sir.
Yes, Andrew. I wonder if you could please give us the reasons for the dismissal of the psychiatrist, Dr. Lopez. Yes.
Dr. Lopez hasn't informed me of that, but his dismissal followed an article that was written by Gary Linnell that appeared in the Bulletin magazine in May 1999, I think it was, where he questioned the IQ levels of Martin Bryant and the tests done by Dr. Ian Joblin. He said he believed they were flawed, which tells me that Martin Bryant's, we'll say, intelligence was higher than 66. The other thing he also questioned were, he states that Martin Bryant was not as silly or not as some people made him out to be. And by that I would believe that Lopez was again referring to Dr. Sale and Professor Mullen. I've got more information on that. It's far more easy for you to comprehend on the report on my chapter in relation to Professor Mullen.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, madam.
I have a timeline question to ask you. Jim Pollard was driving the BMW and was shot at the toll gate, right?
Yes.
Where it is undoubted that the shooting started, give or take, a minute around 1:30. At 5 to 4 at Bingara, a policeman arrived on a next of kin's door to notify them that that person had been killed at Port Arthur. At that stage, it really wasn't even hitting our rural airwaves.
How did you do that?
It is 40 minutes drive to the person's place out of Bingara, which meant that the timeline there would mean that that police would have had to have been notified approximately 3:15 p.m. on that day.
How could he do that?
Has there been a timeline done on the notification of any of the other victims' families?
No. Oh my God! How could the police know that? The police were not. The only policeman there at the time was Peter Hessman, and he arrived at 4:26. The police car then went out the gate at 4:30, and that is recorded by staff at the Port Arthur Historic Site.
That is the question, because the policeman definitely arrived at this home with two witnesses at 5 to 4 on that afternoon.
I think you people now completely understand why I say I keep on getting new information all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just an oddity on the IQs. I had an uncle who had an IQ of probably 155, 160, a very clever man. Drove a car 40 miles with a flat tyre because he could not change a wheel. Now, my IQ, I happen to know, is accompanied, I won't give it, is accompanied with A+. The plus alongside your IQ when I had mine done meant that your mental ability was matched by your manual dexterity. Now, has Martin Bryant got A+? Is there any manual dexterity with this bloke?
I have no idea. They don't tell us that.
Well, obviously without the manual dexterity, it wouldn't matter whether he was smart or not. He couldn't do it.
He couldn't do what they say he's done.
Exactly.
They tell lies. And the number one thing I learnt in the police force, you do not believe a person who tells you lies. Oh, I don't know. You know how dumb these bloody policemen are, especially from Victoria.
Yes, sir, your question.
Are you aware of any other case in the history of Australian jurisprudence which has had evidence locked up for 30 years?
Oh, this is a beauty. This is a beauty. That's another lie. All the information we obtained under the Freedom of Information. And that was obtained by my friend Noel MacDonald, who's also writing a book about Port Arthur. I let him do all the heavy work. I just scratch my head sort of thing and try to put the stuff together. But we've got the court document. We've got all the witness statements that were going to be used by the prosecution. We've got the transcript, tapes that were taken at Seascape. We have the full unedited police interview of Martin Bryant, which was by 4 people, not the 2. It was by Inspector Ross Payne, Inspector John Warren, Policewoman Sergeant Jones, and Detective Sharon Bolt. So we've got all of these under freedom. There's never been any suppression. The only suppression that came about was put on by the Judge William Cox for the duration of the court. And even then, the current affair broke that suppression.
Thank you. Your question, sir.
Andrew, has anybody or any group threatened you with the information that you're going around telling the people your version of what happened, at what you found out that happened at Port Arthur? Has any threats been made against you?
Not so much threats, that there have been, we'll say, other approaches. And that only occurred after my friend Noel MacDonald put up a website for me with parts of my book. And this was done through an internet site, a person from an internet site who calls himself Hamish the Inquisitor. It was done anonymously. The site is the publicdebate.com.au, and as far as I can determine, and I strongly believe that it is a sting operation run by the Protective Security Coordination Centre.
Thank you. Sir, your question.
Yes, in the matter of IQs, I've been told that if they gave me a brain scan, they'd demand a search fee, but there may be others present. I couldn't quite join the dots up in connection with Martin Bryant suddenly appearing in England when he was, as I remember, was incarcerated on a capital charge. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? I have heard something about the Tavistock Institute in this connection.
Find out as much of that as you can. It's extremely interesting. Martin Bryant was in London on the 22nd of April 1994 when the case on him brought under the Mental Health Act was heard in camera at the Hobart Supreme Court. And he was represented by Peter Griffiths of the firm Griffiths and Jackson. I have no idea how that could be permitted, but it was. Another interesting fact is that people in Hobart will state emphatically that Martin Bryant did have a shooter's licence, and when asked how he obtained it, he says, "My lawyer got it for me." Geez, I love lawyers. They can do anything.
Thank you. Yes, your question, sir.
I'm highly suspicious about the fact that Martin Bryant didn't have a jury trial. I mean, if somebody commits or is suspected of committing manslaughter even on one person, they get a jury trial. Martin Bryant was incarcerated. He said not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty 35 times in the court. About why? Do you have any idea why a jury trial wasn't instigated directly after that, as I believe it should have been?
Thank you. John Avery, his legal representation, took 14 or 15 visits over 17 days to convince Martin Bryant he had no other option but to plead guilty. John Avery also states, I think, he believed he also had to do the right thing by the community. In other words, John Avery was acting as a prosecutor. Martin Bryant had no legal representation. We were not permitted to have a trial in relation to Martin Bryant.
Thank you. Yes, your question.
Something that hasn't quite been touched on. I believe Martin had reasonable burns all up his back.
Back and buttock, third-degree burns. That's all I'm aware of.
As far as I can understand, if you had supposedly set fire to the house or whatever, you were going to incinerate yourself in it, or you were possibly either unconscious on the floor and all of a sudden realised I'm being burnt and got up and got out of there.
Thank you.
I've got problems how he was injured as well. I really don't know, but everything they tell us again falls into a big flat heap.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Your question.
Are you aware or have you heard of any connection with the school or the Department of Psychological Warfare?
That's John Rawlings Rees.
I've heard, I'm not sure where I heard it from, but there's a chap that rang me up shortly after this and told me a long story about Bryant having made regular trips to England for a year, over a year, and he'd stay there for a few days. He'd leave Tasmania with an overnight bag, be back a couple of days later, and he believed he was being psychologically prepared for this. And then the other thing that came out, and I'm not sure where I heard it, but his psychologist, whom he either went to America or an American psychologist came here, and he was asked at one stage, or that psychologist was asked for Bryant's record. That psychologist said, "I'm sorry, I haven't got his record because my partner died," and the agreement was with most psychologists his records are destroyed, so mine were destroyed too. Now that psychologist, I was told, went to England and became the head of the psychological warfare department in, I don't know, NATO or England or somewhere, but it's pretty vague.
You're talking first of all about Dr. Cunningham-Dax. Dr. Cunningham-Dax went, I think it was about 84, when he interviewed Martin Bryant. The other doctor was Dr. Dix, who died, and all his notes were destroyed. Dr. Dix, I do believe, may have been associated with Tavistock. Cunningham-Dax certainly was associated with Tavistock. Anyway, I've only got this small, full bit in. Right. Now let us consider the words of the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Tim Fischer, when he spoke to a group of professional shooters at Alice Springs in May 1996. If we don't get it right this time, then next time there is a massacre, and there will be, then they'll take all our guns off us. What Mr. Fischer is stating is that unless Australia brings in the required legislation, then Australia was going to suffer another massacre. The legislation was initiated and Australia has had no more massacres. The fact that many have ignored the new ideology-bound firearm laws and that firearms are still easily obtainable on a black market is irrelevant to these laws. However, what must also be considered is the comparison between the statement made by Tim Fischer and the then Premier of New South Wales, Barry Unsworth, back in December 1987, when he prophesied there will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania. He was quite right. After the massacre at Port Arthur, Australia did get a form of uniform gun laws, but not quite what Barry wanted. We should also consider the actions of the Australian Prime Minister up to and on the 10th of May 1996, when the new laws were implemented. The fact that the 10th of May meeting had to make its decision in time for the evening news is straight out of a James Bond fictional scenario. Here is the 6 o'clock news. Big Ben chimed 3 times today at 2 o'clock, and the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. John Howard, was successful in forcing the various states and territory police ministers into accepting his unconstitutional new guidelines for a total firearm control in Australia. Right? But there are other political ramifications regarding the uniform firearm laws in Australia. And Graham Richardson appeared on the Today Show about the 5th of May, after the Port Arthur massacre, and just prior to Mr. Howard announcing his 10th of May meeting, and laid out the whole political scenario of why the Port Arthur massacre had to happen. Graham Richardson told us why it had to happen. Barry Unsworth had discovered, in his effort to retain the New South Wales government in 1988, that any government that moved into the area of gun control would lose power at the next election, be that state or federal. Again, because of the moves against the gun owners of Australia, there was a new political party born, and that party had to be destroyed before it gained too much strength within the political sphere. However, Graham Richardson gave out one further clue to demonstrate just what the push was regarding firearm control, and that was the shift of power from the states to Canberra. Graham Richardson stated that the easiest way for uniform firearm laws would be for the states to cede their constitutional powers in relation to firearms to the federal government. However, we are then informed that Premier Bob Carr had already initiated legislation in regard to ceding that power to the federal government. Now, this was before John Howard had announced his national guidelines policy, and it must be viewed as a ploy to have the Prime Minister adopt the full Labor Party policy in relation to gun control, a policy that emanated from the United Nations. What this demonstrates is that the move for a total firearm control in Australia is based on that power being controlled by Canberra. And that policy lines itself up with other initiatives that have emanated from Canberra in the past decade, such as a push for a republic and a new constitution, which would give Canberra complete control over Australia, which was the complete opposite to all those Australians who realised the dangers of centralised power and opted for the American system of federation of states back prior to 1900. What happened in regard to the Port Arthur massacre was that the entire judicial system was stifled. We were never permitted to have any form of a proper trial for the accused Martin Bryant. We were never permitted to have a coronial inquiry, nor shall we ever get any such proper inquiry into that tragic event that has affected so many Australians. Our constitutions have been overruled, our judiciary has been compromised, so much so that we appear to be that of Keating's Banana Republic. And our government representatives no longer hear the voices of their constituents. So what happens the next time Australians feed to hear the new ideology? Who will they murder to bring us into line? Will it be your parents, your brother or sister, or your children or your grandchildren? Don't say it will never happen, because it already has. Had Australia had one politician with the guts, with the integrity and the honesty to tell Australians just what had happened, then the bluff would have been called, and little Johnny Howard would never have had to wear his flak jacket at Sale or in Queensland. Australians, though, are not that lucky.